Okay, welcome everybody. This is the third and final webinar in our series on radical place leadership. This one poses the question, what next after the English Devolution White Paper? So I'm Andrew Laird, I'm the Chief Executive of Mutual Ventures. We're a consultancy that works with central government, but also with places to help improve collaboration and better support for people. And we're going to be talking a little bit about that work here. I'm delighted to be joined today by some fabulous colleagues to explore this. We've got Rachel Crosley, who is the Corporate Director of Community Health and Wellbeing at Brent Council. We've got Tom Shakespeare, who is the Managing Director of Brent Integrated Care Partnership, and my colleague from Mutual Ventures, Hannah Hispansky, who is a Senior Consultant and was the project lead on our work with Brent. So I'm going to start by setting the scene, including what exactly radical place leadership is. Rachel and Tom will then tell us the Brent story, including why they wanted to change the way organizations in that place worked with each other. And then Hannah will provide an overview of the work we did together and what we achieved. So in terms of housekeeping, there's no fire drill, I'm assured, in anyone's place where they are, but we will be recording this and we'll make the recording available. And there's some supporting documentation around radical place leadership we can send you. If you want to ask a question, you can use the Q&A function at the bottom of your Zoom screen, and we'll do our best to get to as many of those as possible. So to set the scene, the English Devolution White Paper came out just before Christmas. It included a promise to devolve more powers to bigger, broader sets of strategic authorities, and they would hold varying degrees of power, but it also had a reorganizational element around two-tier areas where districts would become part of larger unitaries. There was a pretty big focus on economic growth and the powers that are required for that, much more so than on public service reform. Although there was a suggestion that mayors could be integrated care partnership chairs or police and crime commissioners if appropriate. But all in all, it was pretty light on public service reform. And whilst White Paper didn't explicitly push for place-based person-centred service delivery, the proposed structural changes create the conditions for further integration. And it is very much now in the hands of places what they do. And this is where the concept of radical place leadership comes in. So radical place leadership is all about shifting power closer to communities and organising service delivery across a wider range of services to focus on the support that people really need rather than what organisations need. Public service professionals everywhere will have examples of individuals and families who are receiving huge amounts of support from different parts of the system, but are continuing to decline because their fundamental challenges are not being addressed. And radical place leadership encourages places to look beyond addressing a presenting condition that maybe that organisation or service is mandated to address, and to try and get to the underlying challenges that people and families are facing. And this necessarily requires closer integration within public services. So that includes health services, primary care, community care, mental health, adult social care for sure. Also other services within the council like housing, children's social care, public health, but also police, DWP, full range of services that a vulnerable person or family might need to draw on. And to bring this to life, a real example of a challenge which is a concern to all of the services I've just mentioned is a person experiencing homelessness. And this is an example very relevant to our colleagues in Brent. None of those services acting alone can truly understand the context of that person's life and really support them out of that cycle without working together. They can only individually address a little bit of the challenge that they face. And this means acting early in a preventative way rather than just addressing that presenting condition. Reorganizing how organizations and services work in an area, it takes time, effort, and resources. And all public services are under pressure at the minute, and finance directors everywhere are demanding savings. So we have to make the case for how this more relational way of working saves money and avoids future cost. The traditional new public management way of working would say the sensible course of action is to demand more for less, inverted commas, from each service area, possibly raising eligibility criteria thresholds, lowering targets, tightening or cancelling individual contracts with providers. And although this report, and through this approach, you can imagine how savings can be found and possibly short-term financial targets may be hit. Finding efficiencies services which remain siloed is not sustainable. And there are several main reasons for this. Focusing on in-service savings fails to address top-line demand in the whole system. Over time, the savings that you found will be lost and efficiencies build up again, as siloed services are not able to get past their required focus on the presenting issue or condition. Demand for services will therefore continue to grow, and in a couple of years, the services will be back in the same situation, with people who have been originally referred to the service returning with probably more costly needs as their situation deteriorates. And also, looking for efficiencies in a siloed service does nothing to address the huge amount of cost, both human and financial, of passing people from one siloed service to another. This involves repeated and costly assessment and requires vulnerable people to tell their story over again. As needs become more complex, the space between services increase in both size and number, and the costs ratchet up again. And linked to this, dealing with siloed services individually does nothing to address the huge amount of duplication that exists between services and organisations across the place. And any workshop that you're ever at, which brings together staff groups from, for example, council-run adult social care services and NHS-run community services, will expose the full nature of this challenge. So I just want to say a quick word on place and why that is a key concept here. So some of the NHS leaders we speak to, not in Brent, I must say, are starting to focus more on their system or integrated care board goals and targets, and they're skipping place and thinking how that can link directly to neighbourhood delivery. And they're thinking about neighbourhood delivery as the delivery mechanism for those integrated care system goals. And I think we would all agree better integrated working at a neighbourhood level is the right ambition for public service reform, but de-emphasising place is a big mistake. This is the space between systems and neighbourhoods where public service leaders from all disciplines need to get together to create an enabling environment for truly joined up and collaborative working. And this is not possible at a system level. There are too many players, it's too large scale, and it's not the right geography to think locally and forward relationships that are needed. And this collaboration needs to happen at a place level, and that's usually on a council footprint. So finally, the Mutual Ventures team, and that's why we are here today, have been working with organisations in Brent to design a new model of radical place leadership. And this builds on the experience of designing and implementing the Wigan Deal, developed by our brilliant non-exec director, Professor Donna Hall, who worked with us on this project, and also from Changing Futures Northumbria and the Liberated Method, developed by Mark Smith. And our focus is on how you create an enabling environment so that the type of properly integrated neighbourhood level working becomes the local system rather than having to fight against it. So what I'm going to do now is invite Rachel and Tom to give us a bit of introduction and context to Brent. So Rachel, I think you're going to speak to us first, and Hannah, if you could share the slides, thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Andrew, and thanks for the invitation today. Really great to be part of the conversation. So for those that don't know Brent, it's in northwest London. You may know where Wembley Stadium is. That's right in the heart of Brent area. So as a borough, significant diversity, over 140 languages spoken, and overall quite a young population, but we are seeing quite a change in the demographics, both emerging communities that we haven't seen before, and also increase in the age of our demographic as things progress. So we've had our borough plan, and here it is on the screen since 2023. As you'll see, a real focus on the kind of whole kind of life cycle. So a real focus on inequalities, that real best start in life and healthier Brent, but also in regeneration and kind of growth in the borough. We've built a significant number of new houses over the last 5 to 10 years. But despite that, still seeing a real challenge, as Andrew said, around temporary accommodation and homelessness, which is being seen across London and other parts of the country. So overall, in terms of our finances, it's all relative in local government, but we have done quite well, still in a kind of sustainable budget this year. It isn't sustainable in the long term, so still gaps into the next 3 years, which are quite significant in terms of our finances, which is really where we've started to look at actually devolution. And while we're not an area that will be looking at kind of local government reorganisation, actually the opportunities of devolution, of connecting services and making our kind of Brent pound go further is really where we're focused. And a lot thinking about public sector staff in terms of that feeling of savings and that feeling of a decline isn't motivating for staff, but actually really thinking about what are we delivering to the resident and how do we do that better is really where we're focused at the minute. So we know that to do that, we need to work really differently. We had a very clear direction, both politically and from our new chief exec in terms of her leadership, to look at new ways of working, kind of better understanding our community's needs and what they want for their lives, and then working with them on what some of those answers might be. I wouldn't say that's necessarily where the council's been previously. So I think relationships with partners work very effectively, particularly in that kind of voluntary sector, but it is quite traditional. So we're predominantly in a very grants and contracts based kind of relationship. And a lot of that role feels quite the council in that parenting role rather than that equal partnership. And general sense that has led us to a position where the voluntary sector and that kind of wider community organisation grassroots are waiting to be invited into the space and are less entrepreneurial, less innovation being fostered, and certain sense of wait for what we want them to do rather than coming forward with ideas. Tom will speak to the kind of health relationship, but whilst a lot of strong local links, a lot of really good work out the back of COVID that's continued, it is a complex system in North West London, and that sometimes plays into some of the politics of it. So as I mentioned, the population is very diverse. We have significant areas of deprivation and poverty, particularly in the south of the borough. And we have got some really good examples of outreach services that are really kind of focused on that kind of cultural competency. But overall, if we look at our relationship with communities, I'd say it's not proactive on either side necessarily, and some of that kind of more inclusive engagement feels quite limited, and our residents certainly don't advocate strongly for themselves into our governance processes currently. So as many councils, we've embarked on a kind of wider scale change programme to really think about how we use our resources going forward, and how we kind of equip ourselves to be a better partner. Hannah, do you want to switch on to the second slide? So one of those is around kind of like the outer link around being really clear about how we enable ourselves to be able to drive and be a better partner. So our kind of digital data, property expertise, also kind of changing the way we work across the borough. So how do we work better with the voluntary sector about building that capacity? How do we really engage in a positive resident experience where they're not telling us the story 17 times? And actually, what's the culture got to look like going forward to be actually more values based? It would be easy, given that kind of lack of engagement in some ways from our residents, to almost exist and continue to respond to just those things the council needs to respond to and reduce down to our core offer. But we absolutely know that's just going to store up issues and is actually going to increase demand on some of our statutory services long term, and actually focus too much on almost waiting for people to reach crisis rather than supporting people to live the lives they want to lead. So instead, our vision is really focused, as you see in that green section in the middle, of being much more community-led, embracing community power and kind of flipping the council from being very focused on responding to crisis to trying to support a real focus on prevention and focusing on strengths of our communities rather than the problems. We wanted to use the fact that in the kind of health space, we've got a real focus on that kind of integrated neighbourhood team approach, particularly in the kind of complex health needs, long-term condition space. But how do we build out from that and be wider in our kind of prevention approach so that residents feel healthy, happy and safe in Brent? And the real challenge for us and why we worked with Mutual Ventures was thinking about actually how did we start that journey in a way that helped to reset the partnerships as an equal relationship and not a council process. You know, we started from a point of view, as this slide says, of we've got a council change programme, but actually how do we move that to being we have a Brent partnership that wants to do better and more positive work with our communities. So we wanted to do the work in a really different way so that we built that kind of shared approach to the future. So that was the kind of problem and where we started the piece of work, and Hannah later will talk to kind of how we went through that process together. But I think I'm going to hand over to Tom just to bring some of the health side to life.
Thank you very much, Rachel. Tom, it'd be great to bring you in now, and obviously health is a key partner in this.
Thanks, Andrew. Thanks, Rachel. I'll just set a little bit of sort of context for health within Brent. So Brent is one of 8 boroughs in Northwest London integrated care system. We have a really strong local partnership, I think, across the providers. That's acute mental health, community, primary care, voluntary sector, and the council, and a really clear shared set of priorities and things that we work to. My role, I think, is very much accountable to that partnership, but also a dual accountability into the ICB. So I think very much a sort of role in trying to integrate and bring together the various different parts of the system where with that shared agenda. As Rachel said earlier on, I think health inequalities have really driven and shaped in that sort of post-COVID environment how we focused those priorities and where we wanted to work, spanning all different parts of the system from acute through to community. Our primary care context, I think, we've got quite complex primary care environment, which I think is quite important for us. We've got 3 federations, we've got 7 PCNs, and we've got 5 neighbourhoods. We've got a real challenge, I think, in trying to bring the most geographic of those groupings, the neighbourhoods, together and bringing practices to work together in that really strong geographic basis across the partnership. I think the other thing, post sort of reorganisation and the creation of the ICBs, I think we've really run with the idea that actually there is power in not being a commissioner, actually, because what it really does is allow you to drive, those relationships and partnerships and thinking about the individual at the front and centre of what we do. So we've seen that not as a threat, but actually as a real opportunity to work differently and to cement and build those strong relationships. I think we've got some really good examples of upon which we can build, I think, some of that work. Rachel alluded to it earlier, but we've got a programme around Brent Health Matters, which is really about taking services out to communities, operating in faith, community settings, providing clinical services in those settings, and working with communities on the design and the solutions around potentially some of the access challenges that we've had within a number of our communities. As Rachel said, our communities interact with services in very different ways. We've got different experiences of those services from other parts of the world that they've come from, and culturally and historically, interact in different ways. And so we've needed to respond to that, I think, as part of our work on health inequalities. And Brent Health Matters is a programme that I think is supporting that. We've also got some work going on in some of our postcodes, particularly in Harlesden and in Willesden, which are two of our neighbourhood areas, working with our mental health provider about trying to build into our core services a very different way of working around listening to communities that, particularly where we've got in those 2 postcodes, significant numbers of people appearing in mental health crisis. But the thing that really stuck out to us when we undertook some analysis around that was that they weren't known to service at all. So when we looked at their interactions, they weren't known to service, but they were appearing in crisis. And that really said to us that we are doing something wrong there and we need to do something differently. So the pilot that we're leading in those areas of mental health is about those teams, the home treatment teams and community connectors, working with Brent Health Matters and building really strong connections with communities to try and understand and then systematically address in terms of how we work within those services to do something differently. And the hope is that becomes sustainable and a different way of working. We've also got other services which I think are building blocks, our paediatric hubs. I think increasingly working with our family wellbeing centres, existing established multidisciplinary team working around frailty, all provide, I think, a foundation. But none of those things, I would say, are enough individually to add up to that sort of total picture of those services, that radical place leadership. And I think in many cases, they're not yet embedded as business as usual. So there's a real opportunity to use those as levers to drive some of that change. And I think from a health perspective, as Rachel said, we see the sort of integrated neighbourhood teams and the council, initially led radical place leadership work as completely symbiotic, and interdependent. We see this very much as a mutual agenda, and that health and the social determinants of health are absolutely inextricably linked, whether you're looking at housing and employment, skill, a whole range of other things. We're critically independent, and we need to be working differently with individuals, particularly in that complex kind of needs environment, to do something differently. The good news, I would say, is that we've got, despite the challenge I talked about earlier in terms of the complexity of the primary care environment, we've got individuals within that system and leaders within the primary care system who are passionate about this and get it and get the interdependence. So I think that really provides us with an opportunity to motor. I think that the willing is there. I think there are probably, I would summarize 3 challenges that we've got. One, I think, is that sort of complexity. And I think that real challenge of we need to stop, there are so many different parts of what integrated neighbourhood teams need to be a success. But I think our real challenge is starting somewhere, going where the energy is, and starting small and building from that. Capacity, I think it's a real challenge, particularly when we're going to be asking teams to be doing things differently, putting more time into potentially some individuals, and thinking about how we're freeing up time for people to be able to do that sort of work. And I think our solution to that is we just need to be pragmatic, and we need to be opportunistic, and we need to look at where there are resources that we can potentially do some of that in a different way, because we're not expecting that there is going to be big slugs of money that follow this. We're going to have to do it within the resources that we've got. And the third challenge, I think, is around capability. So that we need to move beyond those sort of traditional professional silos of I need to treat people, this individual in this particular way, and my professional body says that I must do this, to one of thinking about where the individual really is and what is really driving, what's the underlying thing that is driving those needs. And I think that requires a very different way of working, a different professional skill set, or at least a professional skill set that is open to working differently with others. So I think we've got the willing, but I think making that wholesale and making that business as usual is our real challenge. So I think that was it from me, Andrew.
Thank you. Yeah. Thanks, Tom. Thank you very much. So Rachel and Tom have given us a really good background as to the situation in Brent and some of the great things which are going on already. And Hannah, you're going to tell us about what we did.
Great. Can you see the slides okay? Yes. I can't hear you, Andrew, but I'm presuming you're saying yes. Yeah, okay, great. Thank you. And yeah, I'm just going to talk a bit about the process that we went through with Rachel, Tom, and other colleagues in Brent, and try and break it down to explain what this kind of looked like in practice. And as Rachel said, how we started this off. So our approach kicked off with a series of partnership meetings between different partner organisations across Brent. So that's the police, different team members from the council, colleagues from across the health system, some really great voluntary sector leaders as well, faith leaders. And these partnership meetings aimed at fostering open conversations about common challenges that people in Brent are facing, and initially just kind of ideas for improving collaboration in Brent. They were quite simple but important for 2 reasons. So as Rachel mentioned, they brought together partners together for either for the first time or for the first time in years, particularly since COVID. And we heard quite a lot that collaboration and kind of place-based working was working really well in COVID, but had kind of slowed down in more recent years. And this was an opportunity to reset that relationship. We also know how busy everyone is with their day jobs and firefighting constantly. So these partnership meetings provided an opportunity for everyone to pause, reflect, and think about differently about how we can best support Brent residents. And I won't repeat what Rachel and Tom have said on the need for change, but there was a lot of energy and enthusiasm in those conversations for doing things differently and kind of trying and testing and learning together. Next step was a baselining exercise that we worked with colleagues on, which was a fancy way of saying understanding Brent's starting point as a place. So a number of strands to this. So it involved reviewing key documents, vision statements, ambitions, strategies of the council and other partner organisations to understand Brent's current direction of travel and what's already happening. A big chunk of this as well was just talking to people to understand different perspectives on how the system was working, challenges people were facing and what could be done about it. And we also had a look at the data and conducted a staff survey to gain a better understanding of different perspectives of what was going on and current ways of working. And this all fed into what we called a place leadership baseline report, which was shared with partners and hopefully helped achieve a shared understanding of Brent's starting point for this work, the challenges that were being faced and the strengths that could be built on, as Tom and Rachel have already mentioned. Next step then in our approach around establishing a shared vision and identifying priorities. So one thing that came out of the baselining exercise was that whilst there were lots of strategies in place for both the borough across a whole and different priority areas, it wasn't clear that all partners were united behind one core vision for the future of Brent, or easy to identify a kind of clear set of shared priorities between partners. So a working group came together from across the partnership to discuss the findings from the baselining exercise and define a more radical vision for public service collaboration in Brent, which I know Rachel has actually already mentioned in this webinar, as well as agree a kind of set of priorities that we could focus on in the short term as a way of getting started and getting this off the ground. And it was at this stage that prototyping a new way of working with residents in a particular geographical patch was discussed, and that was in Harlesden, which Tom has mentioned already, as kind of a logical first step to test and refine a new approach to public service delivery and to supporting residents through an integrated neighbourhood team. And the idea of starting small in one area is based on lessons from other areas, suggesting that it's kind of helpful to test and learn from implementing a new relational way of working in a smaller geographical patch before attempting widespread changes and kind of scaling that up across the borough. The fourth element of our approach then was the design and development of a neighbourhood delivery model, taking this idea that it would be good to prototype a new way of working in one particular place. So we work with partners through a series of kind of conversations and workshops to develop what we've called a neighbourhood delivery model that showed how a range of public services can work together differently using a specified geographical footprint as the anchor point for supporting residents. And as Tom mentioned, this builds on a lot of the great work that was already being led by the Integrated Care Partnership to develop integrated health and care neighbourhood teams in the 5 Brent Connect areas that exist, with a particular focus on the work that had already been done in the Harlesden Brent Connects area. And as Andrew mentioned, a lot of this was also shaped by learning from successful place-based working in other places. So particularly the work in Wigan through the Wigan deal, the Greater Manchester model and the Liberated model from Changing Futures Northumbria, but in a way that was tailored to Brent. And I'll show you a bit more about what this looks like shortly. So fifth and finally, was at the same time as developing the neighbourhood delivery model, we supported partners to identify 3 priorities for the neighbourhood team for them to begin to explore, which focused on prevention and early help. So the first group of people were people at risk of homelessness, so those not living in a safe and secure place that's called home. Secondly, people living with debt and experiencing financial challenges and the risk of financial exclusion. And thirdly, children not being ready for school. As part of this also, we supported with identifying the most appropriate analytical tools and approach to identifying individuals that the integrated neighbourhood team would support. And this was pulled together in what we called a prioritisation framework, which sets out the practical next steps for getting started with this work. So just to give you a bit more detail about the neighbourhood delivery model and share some of the design principles that we co-produced with Brent. I won't go through all of these, but just to pull out a few. The first one is a more joined up experience for the resident, and this is what it's all about. So each individual, the idea is that they have a lead worker and they'll only have to tell their story once. That lead worker acts as a central point of contact and then pulls in resources and expertise from across the system as needed. And as Andrew mentioned, this is very different from the kind of current approach to public service delivery, where individuals have to navigate a very complex landscape and kind of get past from pillar to post. The second is that it's preventative and proactive. So we'll use shared intelligence, and that's both your data and your community knowledge, to identify residents proactively and offering support early to help them to prevent crisis. Thirdly, starting with the person and taking a relational approach. This is the idea that the support is built around the relationship between a citizen and a single lead worker. So support is bespoke by default rather than service-centred or kind of pushing someone down a prescribed path. And the final one I'll pick out is that all people and services are equal. So the idea within the team is that there's no hierarchy between different services and team members in the way that the team will behave towards each other, but they are all working towards a common goal of achieving the best outcomes for the people that they're supporting. So this slide gives you a sense of the team composition, and I guess having the right people in the right positions will be absolutely crucial for the integrated neighbourhood team to work. This is very much a starting point for the integrated neighbourhood team that we in Brent and in Harlesden, based on data and community intelligence about the needs of Harlesden communities. But at the core of the integrated neighbourhood team is the relationship between the individual and their lead worker, and the starting point is to ask the individual what matters to them, rather than what is the matter with you. In terms of who the lead workers are, they come from a core team of around 10 to 14 people, and they're working together on a regular basis, ideally daily, focusing on kind of collaboration and joint problem solving. In this setup, lead workers are kind of specialists who excel as generalists and are able to view the person as a whole rather than through the lens of their specialism. And as shown on the diagram as well, some of those core team and lead workers should come from your voluntary sector organisations as well. You also have your team manager there who's responsible for providing the kind of necessary leadership and coordination of those team members. And then taking one step back, you have your wider team, including specialists who can be brought in or pulled by lead workers as needed, depending on what that person's needs are. And I think Tom made this point already, but it's really about the capabilities opposed to kind of professional backgrounds. So what came out so strongly was having the right attitude is so much more important than your kind of professional capabilities or experience, and being able to see someone as a whole and kind of have that relational approach is yeah, the be all and end all really. My final slide just on our approach is around finding the people who need support. So a big question throughout this process was, who are the integrated neighbourhood team going to support and how are we going to identify them? So going back to that design principle that the integrated neighbourhood team, their support should be proactive and preventative rather than reactive. And this slide hopefully shows that there are a range of different ways of identifying families and individuals to work with, all the way from kind of starting with who you see on your way into work, through to more complex statistical analysis like segmentation and risk stratification, which health colleagues might be familiar with. So as part of our support, we worked with Brent to identify different ways that families and individuals might be identified. And I think the key point I'll leave you with before passing back to Andrew is that bottom statement. So as long as you're getting to the action that addresses the factors contributing to families and individuals experiencing poverty and inequality. It doesn't really matter where you start. The important thing is getting started.
Thank you, Hannah. Really good overview. Top job. I'm going to get straight into questions now. So Rachel, one for you first. So quite a few people that we speak to around the country, certainly pre the devolution white paper, were kind of waiting to see what government would do and whether government would encourage or bring out a program or something. And I think, given that there was very little on that within the white paper, you probably feel quite good that you did get started when you did. So what was your thought process, or what kind of created the conditions where you felt able as a place just to get cracking?
So I guess on the kind of government bit of this, I think local government's been very clear with the last two governments that they didn't want top down, and we didn't want to bid for things, and we didn't want to be told what to do. So there is something about, if we don't want to be treated in that way, then we actually need to take control. So I think we were definitely in the space of, okay, there are some clear intents, there are the missions, there's definitely an interest in government around this way of working. And actually, if we want the civil service and the kind of government machine to move, we need to show them what it might look like. And I think when we started to look at ourselves and saying, actually, when we say we want a cross-government prevention approach, we don't have a cross-system and Brent approach to that. We don't have a cross-council approach. So actually, it was kind of challenging ourselves to say, we're not connecting as well as we should across, and then thinking it's too hard to do, even at, we're a 340,000 kind of population. As you say, you can't do the big scale kind of integration at that level. So it kind of got us in the space of saying it'd be really interesting to be much more kind of local and really start to kind of think of a few streets, a few families, and really thinking from their perspective. So, and I think I think our staff have been quite motivated by that, of feeling like there's a chance to have a different set of conversations. So yeah, I think we were definitely in that space of, if we don't start with ourselves, how do we influence up and give the kind of government a vision of what this might look like from a devolution point of view? And equally, how are we going to engage better with our residents if we don't go really local? So I think that was kind of where we got to, that made us think actually that then gives us some practical things that framework of devolution would need to look like, in terms of what we might be looking like, saying, because local government's always going to be really different and disparate. We're structured differently, we've got different needs in our populations, we've got different resources. That's kind of where we are now. So actually us being clear about, trust us within a framework, and this is what we can do locally, was kind of where we got to with it, I think. Does that help?
Thank you. Yeah, that's really good. And then Tom, from a health perspective, obviously, as Rachel said there, the council were really up for this, but we found as well that colleagues in health were really up for it also. And health, the NHS can traditionally be quite siloed. So how did you go about getting people into this?
So I think probably worth saying that we've been going at it for almost 18 months or 2 years. And actually, and I think the willingness has always been there, and I think the recognition that there's, particularly with our population, and I think, when you talk to primary care, GPs will say to us all the time, we've got all of these people coming through the front door and all of these other needs and things that are really complicated going on. So I think people get it. I think what's taken us some time, and why it's been really important to spend some time building from the bottom, I think it's been really important we spent some time having those conversations and building from the bottom up, because you could take, you talked about the sort of that ICB model, Andrew, and sort of taking that top-down approach and you must do this. I think because we've taken that time, we've had that opportunity for people to really get it and to be brought into the journey and the direction that we're going. And so whilst we are absolutely chomping at the bit to motor and for this to start feeling like it's made a difference, actually having had that time has been really, really important for us. And I think having partners locally that have lent into that and have seen the importance of this before this agenda has become a big national agenda, has really helped us, I think.
Yeah. And just thinking about breaking down silos between services. So the obvious ones in people's minds will be councils and will be the council and health services. But Rachel, they're also very active in the meetings and in this agenda where colleagues from the police, colleagues from the local third sector. Can you just say something about how that was approached and what the hope is in terms of breaking down the silos between those services?
Yeah, so we've had really positive engagement from the police in terms of those that work really locally and the kind of neighbourhood policing kind of space. So that's been really good. And equally, our voluntary sector were probably a little bit unsure about what we were really asking of them to start with, but then realised that we didn't have a set of answers. We genuinely go and we're interested in a conversation about what we're thinking about the future of Brent. And I think that did unlock it. I think having someone externally facilitating a bit of that space and actually taking us through a process that felt, and it took a bit of time for it not to be the councils doing this, to actually be, we're making some space to kind of think about our priorities together. I think on the siloed point, there is a really interesting challenge, and we are almost double running conversations with teams a bit, because I mean, adult social care sits with me, and there is, it's not free at the point of access for everyone. There are eligibility criteria. Some of those are about not stigmatizing someone into a mental health service at the wrong point in time. So you don't want to lose the positives of those things, but making genuine space for people to say, let's talk about the people that we're all serving, and let's talk about how we would feel if we were in this situation. So we're, I think, very consciously thinking about that leadership of actually how do you have a conversation that you can all participate in, because you're talking about the same people in the same place. And actually our voluntary sector colleagues have been really good at making us think about our language in that space and thinking about kind of the reality. So I think that started to get that equal partnership bit. But I do think you have to almost consciously say, right, we're not saying no to all of those service things are important, but in this conversation, we're talking about an individual and thinking about what the right things are for them. And I think that has helped to some of the silos. I don't think it means we've fixed all the things that we all have. We have a council set of structures, the police have the Met Police set of structures. So we know there are still things we will have to navigate, but in the room in the moment, we try and leave all of that at the door.
Yeah, thank you. And Hannah, I wonder if I could ask you, you led and were involved in all of the workshops, and it would just be good to get your perspective on the local third sector organizations, because they were really influential and had such a powerful voice. And I think you mentioned the community intelligence element of it.
Yeah, and they were really exactly what you said. There was a lot of enthusiasm from them, and I think almost what Rachel mentioned in terms of what the ask was, I think there was a real that they were ready to jump into kind of practical action and problem solving, and I think that was a really helpful perspective to have in those workshops. And I think part of this is about energy, and I think Tom said it as well, going where the energy is and building off of what is there, and particularly in the geographical area that Brent have chosen to start with. There's some great third sector organisations doing a lot of great work, and this work will build on that. And this is not about designing or starting from scratch. It's about building on what's there already. And yeah, does that answer your question? Okay.
It does, yeah. I mean, this is quite often about knitting together in a better way what's already in existence. Tom's already talked about a lot of really good stuff which was already happening. So it was interesting. Rachel, I wonder if I could just ask you, I don't think we've talked enough about the kind of approach to piloting this. So we developed a model, and we then had to find somewhere to start and to try it out. Do you want to say a little bit about that?
Yeah, so a positive was we had various people advocating for their neighbourhood. So that was, felt like people saw this as a positive in terms of wanting the work and wanting to be piloting. And I think we did quite early get to a point of saying we've got to choose a geography. So we need to choose one of our kind of 5 neighbourhoods to start in, and very much then focused on what does the data tell us in terms of need, and in terms of some of the kind of bigger issues, particularly around poverty, which took us to a particular geography around Harlesden. But we also looked at capacity and capability and some of the assets. And actually, it's a really strong area in terms of it's got a neighbourhood forum. It had a number of our big kind of assets and strong voluntary sector services already there. So it kind of felt like actually a lot of the conditions were there to test that much more focused way of working, but also had, you know, some real kind of key issues that we are probably failing people in. So it kind of felt like those things aligned really well in terms of like that need and that focus, and also some of that coalition of the willing, and kind of actually some really good examples where we'd already been running some kind of projects together across and all areas said yes. It's actually one of the integrated teams from a health perspective that's probably gone a bit further, a bit quicker. So actually all of those things came together, and it made sense to start, you know, we have to start somewhere, as you always tell us, and that somewhere has been Harlesden.
Fantastic. Tom, one of the key bits of this work that I found really inspiring was you had some really inspirational local GPs who were really up for it, and that they seem to be a critical element of this. So I wonder if you just wanted to say something about how that role can really drive this work.
You know, I think we've been clear, certainly from a health perspective, that that primary care has to be the front and centre. You know, it is primary care that is seeing a lot of these individuals, particularly with complex needs, on a day-to-day basis. Obviously, there are some individuals who aren't registered with a GP, and that is a separate issue for us to, you know, in terms of work that we're doing to try and address that. But primary care is at the sort of front and centre here, and I think really important, you know, as you say, Andrew, we've got a lot of actually really passionate GPs that are really keen and are putting in quite a lot of time and energy into this. So, you know, because this isn't reimbursed, you know, this isn't you know, so it's all driven by the sort of passion, and I think their experiences, you know, the experiences that there's an opportunity to do something better, to do something different, and I think a genuine feeling that there is the willingness there. I think the fact that we've got the council and we've got other partners, you know, really saying we're committed to this. I think it feels like it's the first time in quite a long time that maybe they've heard that. And actually, I think GPs are really seeing that as an opportunity, and not just GPs. We've got other clinical leads, you know, across a range of providers there that have got equally passionate about this as well. So, but yeah, I would say, I think it feels real. I think it feels like there's an opportunity to do something different, and I think they're bringing their day-to-day experience in this, that there's some, you know, there is an opportunity to do this better, you know.
Yeah, and I think you're absolutely right. So the situation in Brent, there was clear leadership from the top of the council, from the chief exec, Kim, from Rachel, and in some of the other places that we're talking to about this work, it's not driven from that level, and therefore it feels like it will never be a top priority. And one of the things that Rachel and I and Hannah actually have been talking about variously is the need to make a real case for the financial element of this, and how, like I said at the top, this will feel like a nice to have unless we develop really strong models as to how this achieves savings by looking at the cost of handovers, referrals, by really getting to the context of a person's situation. And there's some evidence around the Changing Futures Northumbria work, and some evidence from the work in Wigan, and some evidence from elsewhere. But Rachel, I think from conversations we have, you really want to show how this delivers savings for the whole system, don't you?
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, I think trying to start, so Harlesden has a population of 57,000. So there is something about, and within that, we're going to need to go much more kind of granular. So there's something about getting kind of hyper local, if you want to use that language, and actually really tracking individual cases. So we are looking at how we put some money in to kind of test and learn of this, both thinking about some of, you know, how we invest some of our public health funding, how we think about our kind of joint investments. And I think there's real then tracking those real people stories. So I don't want it just to be kind of monetized, but there's something about how you evaluate it to actually say, well, where would this person have ended up? And how do we look, as you say, at some of those handoffs and some of that kind of side of it as well. But I think if we don't do that bit at the beginning that says, and if we prove this, we're all going to look and commit to how we shift our money and budgets around as a system, then we're going to get where a number of changing futures programs have got to, and other things where government has funded it, where you get to the end of the 3 years and people go, it's a brilliant return on investment, if only we had the money. So I think we're trying to have quite a bit of that conversation now as we go into our next kind of 3 to 5 year planning of the council's budget and health budgets alongside that, and police, to say, well, actually, what would that look like if these things show that they make a difference? How are we going to think about shifting that money? And how do we make the case to government in devolution and other places of the things that should be invested in, because they will make it a sustainable system? So I think we're trying to be in both those spaces now, because otherwise we'll have a really great pilot that stops.
Yeah, no, I think it's incredibly important that we can demonstrate that this is not like a government funded program where there's a load of new roles created. You know, there might be some new roles that you know, team manager, for instance, but by and large, these are existing roles deployed in a different way. We're not talking about huge amounts of investment in this in the long term. So it's really important that Tom, I've got a super easy question for you here, which isn't that easy. How are you engaging with colleagues, or how are your colleagues approaching the constant pressure that the health system is under to engage with a presenting clinical condition, and then that all the talk and like this model is trying to get people to think more preventative? How can colleagues in health get their heads around that?
How long have we got?
Well, it could be a very long or a very short answer.
I mean, I think that is the challenge, really, you know, Andrew, because, you know, I think within Northwest London, you've got a very challenged health system. You know, you've got overactivity in acute. I think you've got a primary care system that is absolutely stretched. So I think your question is very real. I think very pertinent in terms of the challenges, and, you know, speaks to at least one of those two challenges I mentioned earlier around, you know, the capacity point. I think probably there's two answers to this. So one is short term, one is long term. So the short term is, I think we need to start small and try and build something, you know, where there is already the energy, and we need to be pragmatic in that. You know, where there are resources available, you know, how could we use those resources in a different way? So thinking opportunistically, thinking pragmatically, thinking we've got the opportunities to bid for resources, and thinking small and focused as a catalyst for supporting and driving that broader change. I think longer term, you know, and this is a local as well as regional as well as national issue, we need to be making the case for, you know, that shift and investment from acute into prevention by evidencing a reduction in demand, and being really quite robust about that, you know, and to a point at which, you know, you're able to say, well, this is something that we can close in an acute setting as a result of the work that we've been able to do, and to be able to reinvest that money longer term into the system. The challenge we've had, as you know, over many years is that, you know, demand has gone up, and so, you know, any meaningful, you know, even quite successful attempts at trying to manage that demand is managing an ever increasing curve without the resources to follow it. So it's a really big challenge, I think, Andrew. But I think
no, it is, Tom. I'm going to ask Rachel for her view on that from the council perspective. But my own view is that the only way to properly make the case for this type of working is to have a whole place economic model where actually, you know, it's not just about reducing the amount of time someone attends A&E or is arrested. It also needs to look at the other side of the coin, which is, are they back into work now and contributing to the local economy and things like that? And I'm not aware of modelling that does that at a place level, so that's something I'm quite interested in. But Rachel, any final thoughts on any of that, on kind of getting people focused on prevention or anything else?
So I don't like to agree with you, Andrew, but I do agree with you. The economic model bit is the bit we haven't quite cracked, and we need to look at.
You love agreeing with me. We agree all the time, Rachel.
I disagree. I guess for me, the other bit is our whole kind of where integrated neighbourhood teams focus and who kind of leads on them. So I think there is that kind of complex, high need, like multidisciplinary focus bit that health will understand, and you hopefully quite early can practically show some results that stopped that hospital admission. There's then that kind of high risk of early stages long-term condition, which I think is where the key worker model you've talked about will really help us in that kind of how do you help that group. And then there's the real kind of prevention, healthy population side, which is really where we want the community power bit to fit in. So I think if we can get some of that right and model them differently, I think then, yeah, we'll have sorted it, be done.
Sounds good, sounds good. So just finally then, Hannah, I think we've really enjoyed this work, haven't we? And we've learned as much as we hope that we've contributed to. And you know, how have you found the experience?
Yeah, I've really enjoyed work. I'm not just saying that because Rachel and Tom are on
But
the
you can't really say you didn't enjoy it, can you? So yeah, that's a bit of a leading question.
Yeah, learned so much. I think it's this whole work has taken a very kind of, that it's had that learning culture as well, which is important for the actual work. And we've done a lot of we've probably made mistakes and but fallen forward, which is one of the design principles as well, which is about adapting and making sure that, yeah, we're constantly adapting our approach. But I've really enjoyed it, and I'm looking forward to seeing where it goes. So yeah, thank you.
Thanks, Hannah. Thank you, Rachel. Thank you, Tom. Thank you, everybody who joined and everyone who's listening on Catch Up. If you're interested in exploring this type of working, drop us a line. It's andrew@mutualventures.co.uk. I will be sending out the recording and some additional material to everyone who's registered. And yeah, on that note, I will say thank you very much and give everybody 2 minutes back. So thank you again, Rachel and Tom and Hannah.
Thank you.